My brother called a family meeting at his house to announce he had already put our grandfather's property on the market. He said my name wasn't on anything that mattered anyway. I just looked at my grandfather's estate attorney, sitting quietly at the end of the table, and waited. When she placed a sealed manila envelope in the center of the room, my brother's confidence collapsed so completely it was almost hard to watch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that moment felt like breathing after years underwater, you need to understand the 2 years that came before it. My grandfather, a man who could fix any engine, quote any poem, and make the worst day feel survivable with a single cup of his terrible black coffee, was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia when I was 29. My parents had been gone for years, a car accident when I was in college, and it had always been the three of us. Since then, my grandfather, my older brother, and me. My brother had married well, or at least expensively. His wife drove a car that cost more than some people's annual salary, and had opinions about thread count that she shared without being asked. They lived 40 minutes away in a neighborhood where every lawn looked frightened into perfection. I was the one who moved in. I had a small apartment, a job as a school librarian that I genuinely loved, and a life that was quiet and deliberate and entirely my own. I gave it up over a weekend. I put my furniture in storage, told my landlord I needed to break my lease, and moved into the small bedroom off my grandfather's kitchen with 2 suitcases and a box of books. I didn't discuss it with my brother. I didn't ask for permission. It simply needed to be done, and I was the one who could do it. The disease is not like the movies. It isn't a gentle fog that rolls in and softens the edges of a person. It is violent and strange. My grandfather would be lucid for hours, telling stories about Korea with perfect clarity, and then he would look at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into his house and ask where the owner was. He had hallucinations. He saw small animals in the corners of rooms. He was afraid of the dark in a way that broke something in me, because this was a man who had never been afraid of anything in his life. I learned to sleep lightly. I learned which floorboards would warn me when he was wandering. I learned to check the stove every single time I left a room. I became very good at pretending I was not exhausted, because he could always tell when I was performing strength and it upset him. My brother visited on holidays. His wife, to her credit, always brought food elaborate things in containers that required specific reheating instructions. She would hug me at the door and say I was a saint, and I could never tell if she meant it or if it was simply the thing one said in that situation. My brother would sit with my grandfather for exactly 45 minutes, and then he would find a reason to take a phone call in the hallway. What neither of them knew, because they were not there for the long afternoons, was that my grandfather had been planning. He had good days, and he used them strategically. On those days, he was precise and purposeful in a way that reminded me of who he had always been. He asked me to call his attorney, a woman named Eleanor who had been handling his affairs for over 2 decades and had arms like a longshoreman and the bedside manner of someone who has seen every version of human greed up close. Eleanor came to the house 4 separate times in the last 18 months of my grandfather's life. I made coffee, and I left the room because he asked me to, and because I trusted him. I knew he had a will. I knew there was property, the house, which had been paid off for 15 years, and a parcel of land 2 counties over that had been in the family since before I was born. I knew there was a savings account that he called his careful money, money he had set aside with the patience of a man who had lived through genuine scarcity and never forgot what it felt like. What I did not know, until after the funeral, was the full shape of what he had built. My grandfather died on a Tuesday morning in late October. I was there. I had been there every morning for 2 years, and I was there for that one too. I held his hand and I talked to him about the coffee he liked, and the truck he had restored in 1987, and a fishing trip we took when I was 7, and at some point, the breathing stopped. The grief was not clean. It was complicated by exhaustion, and by the strange guilt of relief, and by the sudden, vertiginous sensation of having organized my entire life around a single point that had now disappeared. I sat in his kitchen for a long time after the hospice nurse left, just sitting in his chair with my hands around a mug that had gone cold. My brother called that evening. He said he was sorry. He also said we needed to talk about the house. I told him to give me a week. He gave me 4 days. The family meeting was his idea. He framed it as a practical necessity, the kind of reasonable, adult conversation that mature people have about estates and logistics. He had apparently already spoken to someone at a real estate office, he said casually, just to get a sense of the market, just to be informed. I remember holding the phone and staring at the wall and deciding, very quietly, that I was done being accommodating. I called Eleanor. She answered on the second ring. She already knew why I was calling. She said, "Your grandfather told me you'd call. He said to tell you to bring a sweater because he keeps the office cold." I laughed for the first time in 5 days. I drove to her office the next morning. What Eleanor showed me over the next 2 hours rearranged everything I thought I understood about my family's finances. My grandfather had, 4 years prior, established an irrevocable living trust. The house was in it. The land was in it. The careful money was in it. The trust had a single primary beneficiary. I will not pretend the emotion that hit me when I saw my name on that document was dignified. It was not. But that was only the first thing. The second thing was a ledger. My grandfather, the man who could fix any engine and quote any poem, had also kept meticulous records of every dollar that had left his hands in the direction of my brother over the previous 11 years. A down payment on a house, $60,000, documented as a loan with a signed promissory note. A business venture that dissolved in 18 months, $45,000. A second car, because the first one had the wrong emblem on the hood, $30,000. School tuition for a degree that was never finished, $22,000. The total, with the interest my grandfather had quietly calculated and recorded in his neat, architectural handwriting, was over $200,000. Eleanor set down her pen. "None of it was ever repaid," she said. She did not say it with judgment. She said it like a fact, which it was. "Does my brother know about the trust?" I asked. "He knows there's a will," Eleanor said. "He's been calling my office every 3 days since the funeral asking about probate timelines. I have not yet clarified the distinction between a will and a trust for him because he has not asked, and because people who assume tend to be more informative before the reveal than after it." I looked at her for a moment. "Did my grandfather like you a lot?" "He told me I was the only attorney he'd ever met worth the hourly rate," she said. Coming from him, that was essentially a love letter. I drove back to the house that still smelled like him. I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked at everything clearly for the first time in a long time. I had spent 2 years in a fog of care and duty and love. I had not thought about my own future with any precision, because there was always something more immediate. A medication schedule, a night terror, a fall that didn't happen, because I had been in the right room at the right moment. I had not thought about whether any of this would be acknowledged or compensated, or even remembered by the people who should have been beside me. I was thinking about it now. My brother's house looked exactly like a magazine had exploded into a building. Everything was new and neutral and aggressive in its own way, the kind of home that cost a tremendous amount of money to make look effortless. His wife met me at the door. She was wearing something that looked comfortable but wasn't, and she smelled expensive, and her smile was the kind that works very hard without quite arriving at warmth. She told me I looked tired. She said it with concern, so I said, "Thank you." My brother was in the living room with a man I didn't recognize, who was introduced as someone from a property group, and who shook my hand with the practiced heartiness of a person who sells things for a living. I looked at my brother. He had the same jaw as my grandfather, and none of the same conscience, and for a moment, I felt a grief so specific it was almost physical, not for the man in front of me, but for the man he could have been. "Glad you could make it," my brother said. He gestured to the couch. "We've been looking at the numbers." The numbers, as he presented them, were impressively selective. He talked about the property value, the land, the potential, if everything were liquidated efficiently. He talked about the cost of the estate process and how it made much more sense to move quickly. He talked about market conditions and timing windows. He did not once mention the 2 years I had spent in that house. He did not mention the nights. He did not mention the careful money or what it represented or who had been present when it was saved. His wife nodded along at each point. She was watching me with an attention that felt like calculation. "I'm the executor," my brother said eventually, landing on the word like he had been waiting to use it. Grandfather named me in the will, so I've been in touch with the county on the probate process. I want to move on this in the next 60 days. Which property are you referring to? I asked. He blinked. All of it. The house, the land. It gets divided, we pay out whatever the estate owes, and we split what's left. Split how? Equally, he said, with the tone of someone who considers that to be generous. I looked at the man from the property group. He was looking at a tablet. I looked at my sister-in-law. She was looking at her husband. I looked at my brother. There's someone I'd like you to meet, I said. The doorbell rang. I had texted Eleanor from the car. She had said she would be exactly on time. She was. When my brother opened the door and saw her standing there in her dark coat with her battered case, something moved across his face so quickly I almost missed it. Eleanor had that effect. She looked like the physical manifestation of recorded history. Eleanor, he said, and his voice was careful now. I didn't know you were coming. Your sister invited me, Eleanor said pleasantly. I hope that's all right. May I sit down? She sat at the dining table and opened her case with the unhurried confidence of someone who has never once been rushed in her professional life. The man from the property group checked his phone and then looked at my brother, who made a small gesture that I interpreted as, "This will be fine." It was not going to be fine. I want to make sure everyone has clarity on the structure of the estate, Eleanor began. Before any conversations about sale timelines or distributions, because there appears to be a misunderstanding, and I would rather address it now than after legal filings have become messy. I've been in contact with the probate court, my brother said. I know how this works. You know how a will works, Eleanor agreed, which is why I want to show you something different. She slid a document across the table. It was bound in blue paper. This is the Harlan J. Bennett Irrevocable Living Trust, executed 4 years ago. The house and the parcel on Route 9 were transferred into this trust at the time of execution. They are not part of the probated estate. They do not pass through a will. Probate court has no jurisdiction over them. The room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. That's not possible, my brother said. He would have told me. He told the person he wanted to tell, Eleanor said. She did not look at me when she said it, but I felt it anyway. Who's the beneficiary? His wife asked. Her voice was very controlled. I gave her credit for that. Eleanor placed a second page on the table. My name was at the top. My brother stood up. He walked to the window, which I recognized as a thing he did when he needed to not show his face. His wife was very still. He can't just do that, my brother said, to the window. He had dementia. He wasn't competent to establish a trust. The trust was established 4 years ago, Eleanor said. 14 months before any diagnosis. I have the neurological timeline, the competency certification signed by 2 physicians, and a video recording of your grandfather, stating his intent clearly and without prompting. I record those meetings as a matter of practice. She looked at my brother's back. He was quite articulate. He had strong feelings about the subject. My brother turned around. His face had moved through several things and landed somewhere colder and harder. Then what about the savings account? That's liquid. That goes through the estate. Eleanor set down a third document. Your grandfather maintained a detailed ledger of all financial transfers made to family members over the previous 11 years, she said. Loans, to be precise. Each accompanied by a promissory note, notarized at the time of execution. The trust includes a clause stipulating that outstanding debts to the estate must be settled before any residual liquid assets can be distributed to secondary beneficiaries. She tapped the page. As the primary beneficiary of the trust, your sister has the right to enforce that clause or to waive it. That decision is entirely hers. I watched my brother understand the number. I watched it move through him. $200,000 plus interest compounded annually in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Those were gifts, he said. His voice was flat. There are signed promissory notes, Eleanor said. If they were gifts, your grandfather made a clerical error 11 times over 11 years. She folded her hands. I would not recommend that argument to a judge. You planned this, my brother said, looking at me. There was something in his voice that wanted to be anger, but kept sliding into something more frightened. You had 2 years alone with him. You convinced him. I convinced him to take his medication at 7 in the morning and again at 9 at night, I said. I convinced him that the thing he was seeing in the corner of the hallway was not real and that he was safe. I convinced him to eat when eating felt impossible and to sleep when his own mind was terrifying him. I was not thinking about property law. I was thinking about whether he was going to make it through the night. The room was completely silent. My sister-in-law was looking at her husband with an expression I had not expected. It was not solidarity. It was something closer to reckoning. The man from the property group cleared his throat and said he thought he should probably step outside, and he did, and none of us stopped him. How much do we owe? My sister-in-law asked. She was speaking to Eleanor. Her voice was steady in a way that told me she was working very hard to keep it that way. $218,000, Eleanor said, with interest through this month. My sister-in-law closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she was looking at my brother. You told me those were gifts, she said. They were. You told me your grandfather gave us the money for the house because he wanted to. You told me the business loan was forgiven. You told me. Her voice did not rise. That was somehow more frightening. How many times did you tell me that? My brother did not answer. I need to know, she said, right now, whether there is anything else, any other number I don't know about. Because I am not walking into another room in my life and finding out I've been standing on something that was never solid. She waited. Tell me now, or I will assume the worst and act accordingly. My brother sat down. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He looked, I realized, a little like a person who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just been allowed to set it down, except that the weight had been other people's money and the permission had not been given willingly. There's a second card, he said quietly. A credit account. It's in the business name, but I've been using it personally. It's about $40,000. His wife stood up. She walked into the kitchen, and I heard the sound of a cabinet opening and water running, and then nothing for a long time. My brother stared at the table. Eleanor made notes on her legal pad with the serene focus of a person who has seen this exact scene in 17 different living rooms. I looked at my brother. He was 41 years old, and he looked like someone had removed the armature from inside him, and he was figuring out how to stay upright without it. I didn't want to ask grandfather for more money, he said. Not quite to me. After the business, I knew he was disappointed. I thought if I could just get ahead of it. He stopped. I thought the house would be enough to settle it. Between us. I thought maybe you didn't know about the notes. He taught me how to read a financial document when I was 12, I said. He sat with me at the kitchen table with his own tax returns and showed me every line. My brother made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Of course he did. Eleanor gathered her documents with the precision of someone who does not waste motion. I'll need to formalize the trust acceptance with your signature, she said to me. We can do that at my office this week. As for the outstanding loans, we'll need to discuss a repayment structure. I would recommend sooner, rather than later, to avoid additional interest accumulation. She looked at my brother. I would also recommend legal counsel, not because you've done anything criminal, but because having someone read documents before you sign them seems like a useful practice going forward. She left. I walked her to the door. In the foyer, she paused and looked at me with the expression of someone who is choosing their words with care. Your grandfather recorded a message, she said, with me. He asked me to give it to you after this conversation. He was very specific about the timing. He said, and I'm quoting, "Tell her not to be too hard on the boy. He gets it from his father's side." She pressed a small envelope into my hand. His words. I held it on the drive back. I parked in front of the house and sat in the dark for a while. The porch light was still on a timer. My grandfather had set it 30 years ago, and it had never been changed. I sat there and watched it and thought about the shape of a life that could set a timer with enough care and consistency that it just kept running. Years passed when anyone expected it to. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single index card in his handwriting. It said, "You stayed. I knew you would. That's why I planned it this way. Don't use the money to be comfortable. Use it to be free. Those are different things, Grandpa." Below that, in smaller letters, the coffee in the blue tin on the second shelf is the good stuff. I was saving it. Don't save it. I went inside. I made the coffee. The following weeks were not simple. My brother retained an attorney, and there were several conversations that required Eleanor's presence and a great deal of careful language. My sister-in-law moved into the guest room of a friend's house for a period that I know about because she texted me, which surprised me. She said she wasn't angry at me. She said she was angry at herself for not asking harder questions and at my brother for giving her reasons not to. She said she thought she'd always known something was slightly off balance, but it was so much easier not to look directly at it. I wrote back and said I understood that. I did. The debt was formalized through Eleanor's office. My brother agreed to a repayment schedule tied to his income. He also agreed to relinquish any claim on the trust assets in exchange for Eleanor's assurance that no criminal fraud filing would be pursued, because while the loans were clearly misrepresented, there was a gray area around intent that would have cost everyone enormously in time and money to litigate. I agreed to this. It was not a decision I made from a place of softness. I made it from a place of calculation, because what I wanted was resolution, not prolonged warfare. My sister-in-law filed for separation in the spring. I did not celebrate this. She had not been cruel to me in the way that cruelty is usually performed. She had not stolen from me, or lied to my face, or dismissed my life as inconsequential. She had simply believed things that weren't true because it was convenient, and that is a different kind of failure, one that tends to come with its own consequences. I kept in contact with her, loosely at first, then more easily. She was funnier than I had expected. Without the performance of the person she'd been when she was his wife, she got a job she was apparently very good at. She called once to tell me she'd negotiated her own raise, and it had worked, and she laughed, like someone practicing a skill they'd been told they didn't have. I left the house standing. I know that surprises people. I know the obvious financial logic said, sell it, take the value, invest it cleanly. But I had watched a man live in those rooms for 40 years. I had sat in that kitchen every morning for 2 years and learned the particular quality of light that came through the eastern window in October. I had watched him be reduced by a disease that took everything except the essential thing, the warmth, the decency, the recognition in his eyes when he looked at me even on the worst days. I was not going to sell that light. I hired a contractor to update the roof and the plumbing, because my grandfather's standard for infrastructure was functional, not modern, and the pipes had opinions. I repainted the porch in the same color it had always been. I fixed the step he'd been meaning to fix for 3 years. I kept my job at the school. I took a part-time position, helping digitize the archives of the County Historical Society, which was quiet and specific work that felt exactly like the version of myself I had always been when no one was demanding I be something else. I planted things in the garden that would come back every year without being asked to. My brother called in the fall. He was living in a smaller place now, closer to work. The call was awkward in the particular way that honest things are awkward after a long period of performance. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once, which I thought was actually a sign he meant it, because the people who don't mean it usually say it once very cleanly and consider the matter closed. I said I believed him. I didn't say everything was fine. I said I believed him, and that was true, and that had to be enough for now. Some things take longer than an apology. Some things require a whole season of quiet behavior before they become credible again. I was willing to wait and see what kind of person he was going to be now that the scaffolding of his previous choices had come down. The evening I'm thinking of now is not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no revelation, no document on a table. It was a Tuesday in November, which is when the light gets low and gold in the late afternoon, and the leaves in the yard become a problem I keep putting off dealing with. I was sitting in my grandfather's chair with a cup of his coffee, which is very strong and slightly terrible and exactly what I wanted, and I was reading a book he had recommended to me once, and I had never gotten around to. My phone buzzed. It was a number I recognized as the school district's job listing system. I had applied, 6 weeks ago, for the head archivist position at the district's education center. It was a real position, a full-time permanent position, with the kind of responsibilities I had been quietly doing for years without the title or the pay. They were offering it to me. I sat with that for a moment. I looked around the room, the journals on the shelf, the indexed cards in the wooden box on the desk, The photograph of him and my grandmother on a dock somewhere in 1971, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. I thought about what he wrote. Don't use the money to be comfortable. Use it to be free. I accepted the position. I wrote back to the district with a single condition. I wanted to build a digital preservation program for the district's oldest records, the ones no one had touched in decades because there was never funding and never time. They said yes. I went to the kitchen, and I made another cup of coffee, the good kind from the blue tin on the second shelf. I drank it standing at the window, watching the last of the light go out over the yard. He had been right about the coffee. I should not have saved it.